Hello and welcome to the event today. My name is Ryan. I'm with Halt to Harm Network. It's fantastic to be here with you. Today we are speaking with Joanna Kilgour and Eric Duplace. We're going to be talking about a new poll that reveals a change in Pennsylvania voters' view on fracking. We'll be digging into that a little bit. The big news is actually releasing tomorrow. So you're here, you're getting an early look on this story. So welcome, and I want to say welcome to Joanna Kilgour, who's an environmental lawyer and executive director of the Ohio River Valley Institute, and also Eric Duplace, who is a research fellow and has been working on issues around oil and gas and climate for a couple decades, lives out in the Pacific Northwest. So welcome, Joanna and Eric. How are you doing today?
Hi, how are you? Great to see everyone.
All right.
Great to see everyone. Thanks for hosting this, Ryan.
Absolutely. So I'm really glad to have both of you here today with us because we are definitely curious to learn about this poll that you were reporting on. So let's just, but before we do that, just tell us a little bit about what Ohio River Valley Institute is, just for anybody who's not familiar.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks to everyone who joined the session also that we did earlier this year to talk about our report on the 22 most productive fracking counties in the region. So the Ohio River Valley Institute is a regional policy and strategic communications think tank based in the Ohio Valley. So we cover southwestern Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, and Kentucky. And we have a team of researchers and communications experts who have really been working to try to add some additional capacity to the already very robust movement infrastructure in the region to help provide data-based analysis that can bolster campaigns by dispelling economic myths of the industry and trying to provide some fact-checking and countervailing strategic conversation pieces. And since I know many of you are organizers, I will also just share that I'm sure you've had the experience I'm currently having of using rest stop Wi-Fi. So I apologize if there's any weird background noise or anything going on there, but I'm sure many of you can sympathize with that position. So thanks so much for having us today. And I'm really excited that we're able to share the results of this poll with you all. Many of us understand that the public attitudes about fracking and about all of the infrastructure that comes along with oil and gas development are often misrepresented and misunderstood in the media. So this really gives us some up-to-date, concrete information to share. And I'd love to just pass off the mic to Eric Duplace to share with you some of the top lines of our findings. And also, Eric, if there's anything else you'd like to share about your work with the Ohio River Valley Institute.
Sure, thanks, Joanne. Just taking a look at the chat, and it's fun to see folks from all over the place. Say hi, especially to my friend Matt Krogh, who's in Washington State as well. Matt and I have worked together for a bunch of years on fossil fuel issues. He and I have been involved in a long-running sequence of fights about oil exports and coal exports and gas and petrochemical out in the Northwest. I've been out in the Northwest my whole life. I'm born and raised here and have been at Sightline Institute, which is a Northwest think tank, for about 20 years. And a couple of years ago, I was fortunate to be invited to kind of do some new stuff with my life and get involved in the Ohio Valley and help to design and launch the Ohio River Valley Institute, and got to work with an incredible suite of talented folks I had never met before, including Joanne, who is at the helm of the organization. Extremely grateful for her leadership and experience. As Joanne mentioned, we are really committed to using data and evidence to kind of call the question on the fossil fuel industry and to begin to ask whether or not the kind of received wisdom about the industry is really true, or whether in fact it's vaporware. And folks on this call are well familiar with kind of all of the marketing and hype that bleeds over into outright deception and lies that the industry has used in Pennsylvania and well beyond the borders of the Keystone State for a long, long time. And it's been interesting in my observation to watch how the debate about the health impacts and the environmental impacts of fracking has really shifted over the last, certainly over the last 10 years, but even over the last 5 years and even the last couple of years, as the evidence continues to pour in, those debates have really shifted. Where we have been focusing a lot of our effort recently is kind of in a couple of areas. One is with respect to the economic impacts of fracking, and beginning to sort of run the numbers and say, look, the economic benefits are either very poor or actually negative. We're having some real good success in kind of disrupting the dominant narrative, that's the dominant sort of deception, I would say, that the industry has told for a long time. And then what we'll talk about today is kind of public opinion research that's designed to kind of hopefully to change some of the stories that we're told all the time that fracking is very popular, particularly in Pennsylvania, which of course is an important swing state. The polling results we'll talk about today are specific to Pennsylvania, but I strongly suspect that they are nationally significant. And we'll talk about why that is in a moment. Because as it turns out, the fracking industry is not popular at all. And this kind of nonsense that we've heard for a long time, that if you don't support fracking in Pennsylvania, you're in trouble, just is not borne out. It's not borne out in electoral results. It hasn't been borne out in polling over the last few years. And this new poll that we'll talk about today really takes us to, I think, a much more detailed and positive next step, so that we can begin to say with credibility, fracking is not an issue that you want to be on the wrong side of in Pennsylvania, but the wrong side of it is supportive of the industry. The right side of it, from a popularity standpoint, and this is true across the state, is a standpoint that's skeptical of it and is willing to regulate. So that's kind of my long-winded preamble. I'll spend just a few minutes kind of describing the poll results, and then leave plenty of time for Q&A. This poll will come out tomorrow. The Ohio River Valley Institute will release this poll tomorrow. It'll be up on our website. We'll have some supporting materials, including the materials that I'll describe today. We'll have a digital toolkit, I think, to share with folks on this call. We'd love it if you wanted to kind of help disseminate some of those results, amplify the findings. Our inimitable team from SQL with Jody Hershey's on the call is kind of leading the press campaign tomorrow. So we're hoping to get some good results in the public. So what we're talking about is a new poll that was done in the spring of 2021. So it's quite recent. It was done by Data for Progress, which is a high caliber polling firm. They poll all over the country for electoral races and on issues. They did a detailed examination of Pennsylvania voters' response to questions about fracking subsidies, about trade-offs, and looked particularly at the Attorney General's recommendations, which we'll talk about. The results of this poll, I've been looking at public opinion research on fossil fuel issues and fracking for a long, long time, and more recently have kind of zeroed in on the way that public opinion has been shaped in Pennsylvania. And so for a while now, I've been sort of scratching my head at the notion that that fracking is sort of popularly supported in Pennsylvania. That hasn't really been the case for a while. Even though you sort of see it reflected in the presidential campaigns and so forth. But this poll really takes us to a new level of kind of depth of analysis, and the results were, I thought, just jaw-dropping. Like my jaw almost literally hit the floor when I saw some of the results for this stuff. So in a quick nutshell, kind of 7 major categories of findings. The Attorney General's recommendations to restrict fracking operations are overwhelmingly supported. Almost every one of the recommendations to restrict fracking is supported by every demographic touched in the poll. The poll was weighted to include, to make sure it was representative of gender, age, race, and of 4 geographic regions within the state. So we think it's actually pretty accurate, and the level of support for those recommendations is, like I said, jaw-dropping. Subsidies for fossil fuels and for petrochemical development are very unpopular in Pennsylvania. What's interesting, though, is that subsidies for clean energy projects, when posed in exactly the same way, are extremely popular. So there is a surprising sort of principled support for clean energy and distrust of the fossil fuel industry. And it's not about whether or not the state government is subsidizing it, it's about what they're subsidizing. So we can dig into that in a little bit. We also did the poll also asked some questions about sort of the favorability ratings of environmental advocates and the clean energy industry as compared to labor unions and the fracking industry and the oil industry and the petrochemical industry. And as it turns out, the two most popular things that are polled in Pennsylvania are the clean energy industry, which is kind of off the charts, and right after that are environmental advocates. Those two poll with much higher favorability ratings than most all popular elected officials in the state, higher than labor unions, higher than any sort of fossil fuel aligned interest. And so there's a real sense in which the folks on this call are actually speaking for a sort of majority and for a broadly shared sentiment in the state that I think is often unrecognized in the kind of dominant discourse that we see reflected in the media. This is the group of popular kids. The fracking industry is not so popular. And we can talk a little bit about more of that too. We looked particularly at some regulatory approaches, in addition to the Attorney General's recommendations, but some regulatory approaches to fracking in Pennsylvania. Those turn out almost universally to be quite popular. Particularly popular are the approaches to managing hazardous waste more effectively. And those poll absolutely off the charts. Everybody, I mean, it's almost not an exaggeration. It is an exaggeration, but barely, to say that everyone in the state wants to end the hazardous substance loophole, so that frack waste should be, classified as a hazardous waste, and that transport should be more carefully handled in the state. And then the poll also includes some questions about concern about air and water pollution and climate change. Those poll predictably high. A lot of folks in the state are concerned about both air and water pollution. And then a surprising majority of Pennsylvanians really don't buy anymore. And this has changed over time. When I've looked back at like the Franklin and Marshall College poll results or other polls, this has changed over time. Pennsylvania voters now no longer buy the proposition that the economic benefits of fracking outweigh the health impacts. They no longer buy that the economic benefits outweigh the environmental impacts. And so there is a sense in which that kind of support for the industry as a trade-off, like you get some alleged economic benefit out of it, but and there's a trade-off that has gone away, or it's weakening now quite a lot. And so I think it's kind of changing, I think, the dynamic that should inform the debate. And we're at a place now where a clear majority of Pennsylvania voters want fracking to go away. Either they want it banned now, or they want it phased out over time. And so that too is kind of an interesting dynamic that we're seeing reflected in recent polls, and also in national opinion research that's looked at these questions. So I am kind of tempted, I'm going to talk just a little bit more about the Attorney General recommendations, because some of them are, I think, pretty interesting. And then I'm going to stop talking, and I thought we could just kind of have a conversation for a few minutes. I'd love to answer what questions I can. I suspect a lot of the experts are actually on the call with us, so I don't want to take too much of the microphone. But actually, now that I think about it, I think I'll stop here. We will share, like I said, some social media results. We'll share the summary of the poll results, and then we will kind of break down. We have summaries for each of 7 categories. So you'll see summary results for the AG, for subsidies, for clean energy, overall favorability, and so forth, so that if you're interested in waste, so if you're interested in a particular issue area, you can kind of dive directly into the issue that you might be most interested in. And then we'll, of course, tomorrow also supply the full poll top lines and the full crosstabs. For those of you who don't do opinion research, top lines are basically the overall results from the polling, and then the crosstabs allow you to do sort of a deeper analysis of how people have responded to the poll based on their gender, based on their age, based on their race, based on their geographic region, which are the categories that the poll tried to break it down for. And you can see, if you really want to spend some time, you'll see, I think, some things that were very surprising to me, which is that there are categories, and the AG recommendations are like this, hazardous waste is like this, subsidies are like this, where you can't find a demographic touched in the poll that doesn't support our viewpoint. And so there are kind of the Harrisburg approach to deregulating and subsidizing fracking is extraordinarily unpopular in the state, and it's really hard to find any demographic that supports the way things are now. And so, which sort of raises a different question about how it is that then folks who are skeptical about fracking or want to constrain it or want to end it can use that demonstrated popularity to begin to kind of change the dynamic in Harrisburg. Okay, and with that, I really am going to stop talking, at least for a moment, and would love to just kind of hear from folks, questions, comments, or anything else, I guess. And thanks for your time. I really appreciate everyone being on the call. It's nice to meet many of you for the first time.
Great, and let me know, Eric, if you want to be able to share your screen or anything like that. I saw in the chat, everyone, Ohio River Valley Institute shared a link to the digital toolkit, so folks should be able to open that up and look at it. And feel free to drop questions in the chat here. And then if you have a question, you can also raise your hand using Zoom, and that way we can keep it all organized. If you don't know how to raise your hand, then you can just use the chat. I'll be watching it. So.
And this is Joanne. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Bandwidth issues.
Yeah, you just cut out a little bit there. Oh, there you are.
I just wanted to respond to Diana Dakey's that, you know, about county commissioners and working with county commissioners who may be receiving direct financial benefit. And, you know, one of the things that we've found is the conversations around trying to address some of the structural economy-wide issues that result from prioritizing fracking and fossil fuels in the economy have been productive, even with county commissioners in heavily fracked counties. So we'd be happy to talk more about that offline and that strategy.
Great. So one question that's coming up is, you know, do you think that these results show that the efforts of organizers, of leaders in the network of groups that are confronting fracking, are those efforts working? Do you think that, does it give us any insight into what is working and what's most effective?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, and I'd love to hear from other folks on the phone who've been doing the work in Pennsylvania longer, but I think there's no question that the work is working. And to me, it's one of those cases where, you know, the fracking boom started, you know, 10 plus years ago now. A relatively, a very dedicated but relatively small cadre of activists has been fighting back against it. And, you know, it feels to me like, you know, if there's been a siege, like the walls are just about to come down on this thing. Like it is. That, you know, and if you look at kind of historical opinion research that goes back maybe to 2012, 2013, and take it forward, the support for the industry for fracking has gone way down, skepticism has gone way up, and on almost every one of the core issues where activists have focused, and you know that it's not entirely, but it's been principally health and environment issues. Like the skeptical opponents have been making inroads, pretty demonstrated inroads, to where now, when asked trade-off questions like, do you think that the economic benefits are worth the health impacts or worth the environmental impacts, there's no longer majority support for it. And now it looks like they're probably vulnerable on the last remaining things that they have, which are kind of jobs and economy arguments. They're losing ground on those. And the subsidy questions to me were particularly just kind of galling, because, you know, Pennsylvania law right now, and I would argue that sort of the political discourse in Pennsylvania is completely out of step with where public opinion is. And so, you know, it's one of those things where it's ripe for a rapid, sudden shift in the right direction. We'll just have to see how that actually shakes out.
Would it be all right if I shared my screen and showed some of these results?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. And I can also give you permission to share your screen as well, if you'd like, Eric, if you want to drive this. And so, yeah, I mean, do you want me to do that as well?
No, why don't you go ahead, Ryan? That's fine. I've been talking for too long, probably.
Yeah, so just looking at this, and let me know if there's a specific insight that you want me to look at. But I'm just looking at, you know, point number 1 here in the poll summary. allow Attorney General to prosecute oil and gas companies at 63% support across different demographics. And it's pretty amazing. Could see why your jaw dropped because of everything that you're saying about the sort of popular narrative is don't touch this issue, you know, or else trying to present it as very divided when it's clearly not.
Right. I mean, and a lot of is, as you can, I mean, as you can see, the results are, you know, close to 10 to 1 or 5 to 1. I mean,
Wow.
it's a shocking split.
Limit revolving door, assess sources of air pollution, require disclosures of chemical use, conduct a comprehensive health report, require safer transport. So it's pretty serious. Great. One question coming in here from Steve. Given what the polls indicate, why do you think the recent election kept many of the boosters in the legislature?
I'm not smart enough about Pennsylvania politics to know the answer, but I suspect Joanna or some other folks on the call do have an answer to that question. Yeah, I will really quickly observe that sometimes mythologies and narratives die long, slow, painful deaths, and I think that's kind of what's happening in fracking in Pennsylvania. You could see that with the Biden, presidential campaign in Western Pennsylvania that was still trying to cling to, and the New York Times actually did a terrible piece that I think many folks are familiar with, but kind of wedded to this notion that that fracking is too popular to touch in Pennsylvania, Western Pennsylvania, and it's just not supported by the numbers. It hasn't been supported by the numbers for a while. So I suspect it's one of those things where the belief is kind of still lingering on, even though, and it was probably true 8 or 10 years ago. It's not true anymore. But I'd be really curious to hear from somebody else about kind of how that maps onto, recent electoral results.
Just giving a moment in case somebody wants to jump in.
I mean, just sort of anecdotally, I would argue that because the common narrative is the one that Biden sort of ran on, there were just not a lot of candidates who necessarily ran on sort of an anti-fracking or fracking accountability ticket. There's sort of an assumption, overall that you need to stay away from that regardless of your stance. So, certainly there were independent expenditures from organizations who supported candidates for those reasons, but I don't know if the candidates themselves necessarily considered, thinking about it as a hinge issue as they were running.
Yeah, that's a good point, Jody. It occurs to me, I did look back at the electoral results right after the election, and it was, so Shapiro, who's probably the closest thing to a fracking skeptic or opponent, running in a statewide race, outperformed Biden in fracking counties by a reasonable percentage, which is suggestive of of the theory that I've been proposing here, that the support is much weaker than we think for fracking and the skepticism is much higher. It's not likely that with Shapiro's profile on the issue that he would have outperformed Biden in those kind of mostly rural fracking counties in Western Pennsylvania, if fracking were as popular as has been believed in the past. And I wrote about that on the ORVI website in November, so I'd be happy to share that with folks too in case they want to kind of dig deeper into past opinion research and results. I'll put a link up in the chat in a moment here.
So what do you think that this means, where you have this sort of high support for, in the first slide, or the first point here, high support for allowing the Attorney General to prosecute, limiting revolving doors, all that kind of stuff. And then when we get into looking at, favorability, there's still some favorability here. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, so this stuff looks pretty similar to what you see at a national level, and it is definitely so the oil and gas industry. It's with ballpark 50-50 kind of favorable, unfavorable. people tend to see themselves in the fossil fuel economy. And I've seen lots of opinion research that reflects that. And I think part of the reason, in my opinion, is that we are kind of part of the fossil fuel economy. Like, most of us consume fossil fuels every day. Most of us feel implicated in some way. And so there's kind of it's been shifting. People definitely love clean energy way more than they love dirty energy, but there's still a large core of sort of folks who see it as an important and perhaps fixed feature of our economy. So that's, like, to me, these are sort of like the baseline temperature readings that we need to take, and we know we're doing our work well, either in Pennsylvania or nationally or elsewhere, when we're seeing that long-term shift kind of happen, and we are seeing the shift happen, in ways that I think are pretty positive. And I will add too that clean energy tends to poll, as a general matter, and on specific questions, just really high kind of all the time. So if there's one thing you can rally people around, is generally, clean energy installations. And so a lot of times I think it is wise to kind of focus on that, because it's a strength that's pretty broad for us and reaches into a lot of different constituencies.
So you're saying that, like, there's some hesitancy to say that we're unfavorable of something that we rely on, that there's, so people are looking for, they say, yes, regulation is good, right? Because we don't want the oil and gas industry to be irresponsible. So there's a good section of people that would say they're favorable, but they do agree in tough treatment, high standards, and they also are favorable of clean energy.
That's right. And they don't want it to be subsidized. They are happy to have their tax dollars go to subsidize clean energy, and they really don't like their tax dollars going to subsidize the oil and gas and fracking and plastics. So to me, it sort of expresses that kind of, I think, sort of divided feeling that a lot of folks in America, myself included, feel. But I think the trend is positive. That's just my interpretation of it. But I'm always curious to hear what other folks think too.
I mean, it also shows here that there's favorability of environmental advocates. I'm sure there's crossover with people that are favorable of both. That's what it looks like. And so that could be useful for our messaging to understand that.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, great. So there's a question here. Marty asks, what are the follow-up needs and ideas for your campaign, for campaigns with polling results like this? And Marty, feel free to add more details. I feel like maybe part of the question as well is, like, how would this impact, again, kind of going back to that idea of, like, what's effective, and about the work that we're doing, what could be effective in terms of messaging? What are the big insights that could inform our campaigns?
Yeah. So I would love to hear from folks on the call how they would answer Marty's question. I will say that from ORVI's perspective, we will be producing some kind of follow-up materials, including some messaging guidance based on our understanding of the opinion research. Would love to spend time with anybody on this call, with individual groups or individual activists, thinking and talking about these issues and how they map to specific campaigns and specific geographies. That feels really important to me. So I'd be delighted to spend time with folks kind of working through those issues. I do have a fair bit of background in thinking about these issues, particularly outside of Pennsylvania, but I'm confident that we can use this to kind of help sharpen and inform the way that we think and talk and approach on some of these issues. But I feel like a lot of the expertise, again, is with the folks on this call who have been doing the hard campaign work in Pennsylvania for a long time, and would be very curious to know, how and kind of whether these results can be used to strengthen some of the many good things we're working on.
Anybody want to weigh in on that specific point? And then I also see JD, you have your hand raised. So JD, we'll get to you in just a moment. We'll see if we can get any insight on this topic. And cool, thanks, JD. Nadia?
Yeah, hi. Thanks so much to Halt the Harm and ORVI for another amazing piece of work. And I'm with Earthworks. I'm Nadia with Earthworks. And I guess in response to that question, the first thing that jumps to mind is there are concrete regulatory packages and policy efforts in particular the recommendations that have been put forth by AG Shapiro that are now being converted into a legislative package. So I think having the backing of this data and the, is a pretty solid argument to bring to legislators about, the population wants this. Pennsylvania voters want this. And that's been a missing piece whenever advocates have met with legislators to really convince people that there are those who've been who really feel differently and not buying into that stereotypical narrative that we've been hearing for the last decade of the fracking boom. So that's just one way, but I think there are broader applications in terms of legislator communications in particular.
That's great, Nadia. I would love to talk with you in your shop more about kind of how to craft some of that, how to distill and refine some of this research, and perhaps do more in the future to really support that.
Cool. JD, let me know in the chat if you want to add anything. I saw your hand went down. So Karen, got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks for calling on me. I don't see me on the screen. I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, great. So yeah, I guess I wanted just to always enter my point of view and the point of view of those of us who call for a ban on fracking, that I think the one thing that's been missing in this state and might have made a big difference and could make a big difference going forward is if the organizations in the state would speak with one voice about a ban on fracking, saying that that's what has to happen in the climate context, if for no other reason. And so I think, there's always this objection to talking about things that way. I'm not sure why, honestly, because I don't know anybody who doesn't want a ban on fracking. But I think the one way to frame it that is helpful and correct, actually, is to talk about the drawdown. And so I don't think we should ever be putting anything forward, like any sort of recommendations for regulations or anything like that, when we don't say, of course, what we really need is a drawdown. And that way you can get it in there. You can always get the message out there, and you can put it in the context of a just transition, which is why a drawdown makes sense. But to never, ever bring it up as divisive, and is actually, I think, has hurt communities, frontline communities and grassroots organizations like mine that try to speak about the ban that we need.
Thanks, Karen. Eric or Joanne, did either of you want to respond before we?
No, I think I appreciate the comments. I think it's useful context, and I would love to kind of think and talk more about that particular approach. I mean, this poll does find, like I said, that I think it's 50. If I'm remembering correctly, it's 55% of Pennsylvania voters either want a ban or a phase out. So we are, and they want, and this is a good example here where the results you're putting up on the screen, where the vast majority of Pennsylvania voters, like almost 21 points or something, want local governments to be able to enact bans if they so choose. So I do think there's a strong argument for including some of that language in the messages. Probably calibrated against the need to continue to draw in folks to our side that are going to support efforts that will impact the industry negatively, because that can be one of the most effective ways to drive it out of business. I saw several questions on the Shell cracker plant. I don't know the history of that, so I hope somebody else will answer how that made its way through the state legislature.
Before we talk about that, I want to call in JD, who's had his hands up for a while. JD.
Hey, everybody. Man, it sounds like we all have the same kind of idea. And Eric, one of the first things I was going to ask is, how do we change this information into action? And it sounds like it's kind of all of our concerns. But then my next question is the cost. It seems to me that we're all going to have to take these matters into our own hands. So it seems like I don't believe that we're going to get any entity other than the people themselves to actually have a poll like this. Can you help guide us through something like this, or even just send information, the cost and how to get something like this done? And I'm talking about having it done in Colorado, because I think that may get.
Oh, you're asking about like how could you have a similar, like a poll like this done for the state of Colorado?
Right, even if it's just on you know, on the Front Range or something of that nature, because I'd really be curious. As people have mentioned here, it's very dangerous in this atmosphere today, because as you know, Weld County, I live in Weld County, they talked about seceding a couple times. They want to go into Wyoming because they really believe in the industry. But it seems sometimes I'll talk to other people like within the bigger areas, and maybe there may be some people that are changing their mind maybe. But as mentioned before, some people are realizing the narrative is out there and it's being publicized, and there is massive division. I'm not trying to say that, but I'm really curious to see how big the division really is.
So how could, and let me know, JD, if I'm capturing this correctly, but how can individuals or organizations conduct a survey? You know, what questions might we ask? How might we go about it to try to get similar insights?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a great question. So JD, I'd be happy to talk with you one-on-one after this conversation today. But you know, from my perspective, there's sort of two main things you want to do. One is to go back and collect all of the opinion research that's been done in Colorado about the issues that you care about. And once you've got all that in a basket and had a chance to review it, we can sort of take a look and figure out, you know, what's missing, what do we know, what do we not want to know more about, what seems to be changing. And then on kind of the strength of that review of existing opinion research, then it's a question of going out and hiring a high quality independent public opinion research firm. We use Data for Progress in this case, but there are other good ones too. You know, but somebody who will bring to it real analytical, real methodological rigor and real credibility with media and other audiences. And then it's working with them on designing a survey that kind of fits your budget. And it's all very accomplishable. And like I said, I'd be happy to talk with you about, you know, how that work can happen. Because I do think it can be very useful for sort of deflating myths that are too commonly believed, and that, you know, the industry spends a lot of time promoting this mythology. They've got these big advertising budgets and big marketing campaigns and so forth to get people to believe that there's wide support for them, even when there's not. And so, you know, I think, you know, public opinion research isn't, of course, the only antidote to that. Activism and other activities are super important, but I think this can play a really important role. So glad it seems to be of interest to you.
You know, and I'm going to say that real quick, Ryan, because when we initially started and we're talking about people from other areas, this is why I think it's so important that we talk to each other from different different demographics in different areas within the state or the states, because we're learning so much with each other. And this is one thing that I never even considered. And just to see the difference, the information that you found, this is very valuable to me, because I actually had to come from Loveland to get here. But to me, this is very, very informative information. And I want to thank everybody on here for doing this, because it really is bringing us together. And I just can't praise it enough. Thank you.
Thanks, JD. All right, Matt, we've got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing this. This is honestly, for me at least, a little bit mind-blowing, the polling. I expect some people on this call shared many of the frustrations with the fracking comments during the presidential campaign. But I just wanted to share that polling result number 4 I found, or I think it was polling result 4, really intriguing and exciting about the support for local government action on fracking. I wanted to share that. So I don't live in Pennsylvania. I live in Washington State, Eric alluded to. I live in Whatcom County, which is in the northwest corner of the state. We have 2 oil refineries and a propane export facility. And last night, with a very, very divided county council, we passed a permanent moratorium on new fossil fuel infrastructure in our industrial zone and other parts of the county. And it was years and years and years in the making. And I think the opportunity that this poll shows to have perhaps a distributed effort in Pennsylvania to get local action, supporting land use regulations that would actually stop the expansion of fracking and perhaps start walking it back, is super exciting. And I'm gonna, with your permission, Ryan, I'll send forward some materials after this this call is done that people might be interested in, from that recount the history of how this moratorium came into play, where it came from, some of the other details there, and also how people can pursue the same type of moratorium locally. But in terms, JD was talking about next steps, next action, I think getting this sort of information from this poll out, especially using result 4 and pointing towards local action that could also support statewide action and aggregate over time, would be a really exciting opportunity. Check.
Thanks, Matt. Marty.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. I just thought I'd jump in to say, when Eric and Joanne were working on this and we got behind it, one of the things that the team talked about, and maybe Eric or Joanne can jump in, or even Jody, the importance of kind of keep calling this back. How do we have to mainstream this? Just releasing this polls and say we found it once is not going to be enough. And that the more that many leaders can use these results in your emails out to your base, or in your talking points, or in letters to the editor about your landfill, your ban, your setback, all the different campaigns that so many leaders are working on, the more that this is the mainstream result, the better. So why it's so important that everybody learns about these early, kind of amplifies it tomorrow, and then kind of continues to call back to these results so that they become mainstream, I think is really important for maybe Joanne and Eric to talk about, and why we're excited to see 35 people jumping on this one.
All right,
Absolutely.
let's talk about it.
I'm gonna let Joanne go.
I think we might have lost Joanne actually.
All right.
To the Wi-Fi, intermittent Wi-Fi.
Yeah. Well, Marty, I think the question and the approach is well framed. I am looking forward to getting to know some more folks who are on this call, and to figuring out exactly how we use this opinion research and other opinion research to kind of drive forward these narratives and to sharpen the campaign. So from my perspective, I would just love to hear back from folks about what's useful, how to deploy it. Like I mentioned earlier, I will be working on crafting some messaging guidance based on my understanding of the opinion research and of the campaigns that are in front of us now. But that work is never best done in isolation. It's always best done in collaboration with the folks who are kind of on the front lines of working on these issues. So again, just kind of an open invitation to anybody on the call to connect with ORVI and kind of talk with us about how we can deploy some of this research to make it really effective over the long term.
Yeah, the other thing is, I think there was a question earlier, I forget who asked it, but about the results and the sampling. I know McKinsey, who we worked with, had an issue and she couldn't join us, but the Data for Progress team was going to explain how they came up with that. I don't know if one of you guys can jump in and just answer that question as well. Thanks.
Sorry, Marty, I'm not sure what the question was.
Just that it wasn't a random sample, it was weighted, and just the methodology and the confidence behind the numbers. I think people were asking about that earlier.
Right. Oh, right. I'm sorry. So this is basically a weighted panel survey, and so rather than do some sort of randomized phone calls, it uses known demographics about Pennsylvania voters in order to make sure that the poll accurately reflects the sentiments of the share of Pennsylvania voters who are Democrats, who are Republicans, the share of Pennsylvanians who are men, who are women, who live in the geographic areas. And so what you get actually is a more accurate portrayal of what Pennsylvania state voters think than you would if you did something that was like a purely randomized sample. The confidence interval, this one is plus or minus 4%. So we have reported the results as we have them, but there is there's a little bit of uncertainty. Plus or minus 4% does not actually change any of these findings that we've talked about today. and I will say too that DFP is a top shelf national polling firm. They've done lots of this kind of work in lots of contested issue areas and in lots of contested races. Very highly regarded firm. So they've got that methodology I think pretty well dialed in. Does that speak to your question, Marty? Is there more I could or should say on that?
I was just looking to see who asked it, but yeah, it sounded like a thorough explanation to me.
One question that is in the chat from Krishna is asking if there's any kind of plan to do day of meetings with Pennsylvania legislature to discuss the poll, possibly people, affected, leaders of organizations.
No immediate plans to do day of meetings. We would welcome conversations with elected officials after we've released the results. Tomorrow we'll be working mainly on distributing these results to the press. We'll be on social media. We hope to have support and amplification from folks here. We've already talked with a large number of groups, a few dozen, maybe as many as 40, I think, in Pennsylvania. And this briefing. And so I think if anyone on this call or anywhere else for that matter has ideas about kind of what the next step of deployment is, I'm certainly all ears. Marty and Ryan, I think, are experts in this kind of work, and so probably have lots of good ideas too. But I guess I'll just sort of stop there because I'm sure there are other folks who have sharper thinking about that than I do.
Great. Anybody else have a question or comment? I'm going to take a moment and look at the chat as well. And feel free to weigh in on any ideas too on ways to share these results. One thing that I added here that I wanted to mention is that one of the things that people do with social media strategies is kind of break down each of these 7 areas could be broken into, 5 or 6 different posts with graphics and quotes. Since each page of this report goes into detail about these things, you could easily create a very complete library of sample social posts. And then any organization that is using a scheduling tool that schedules the publishing of posts can sort of scatter those throughout an entire year. So it's called batch production in the sort of media industry, but you can batch produce things. And as a network, this is where we can really help each other because, as everybody knows, you don't want to reinvent the wheel. You don't want to be doing things that other people are doing that, we can help each other with. So we do have some, if anybody here is already part of Halt to Harm Network, you kind of understand how it works and see the potential. And in the future, we have some network-based campaign coordination coming up. So we'll be doing some of that batch production as a group, making sure that we all are well armed with materials that we can use for messaging campaigns. And this particular thing is exciting to me because it's exactly the kind of, session that can generate a lot of, very efficient creation of powerful content to help highlight the work that we're doing. So there's some active comments in the chat here. So if anybody wants to jump on and add some comments, please do. We have a few minutes left in the session. This has been really, really helpful. I'm going to drop the link again to this information in the chat just so everybody has it. And the link is the digital toolkit. I can see a number of people are already in the document, but thank you so much, Eric and Joanne, for sharing this with us. Sharing it to us early, especially, before you release it tomorrow. It's really an honor.
Yeah. And thanks, Ryan. Thanks for coordinating and organizing this conversation. I would love to hear more from folks too. And really excited for the sort of the coming out party tomorrow to see what kind of results we get with the media.
So Steve asks, how do I raise a hand? Steve, I'll take your comment in the chat as a hand raise if you want to chime in. And just for future reference, there's a button in the Zoom toolbar that allows you to raise your hand. All right, feel free to jump in, Steve, if you want. Okay, so one more thing I wanted to mention, we sort of tabled the conversation about the Shell plastics cracker plant. Marcia just added in the chat sort of an explanation of how that worked. Shell approached leaders in the Tri-County region for several years before their intention to come here was ever publicly announced. The ultimate decision and permitting was made by 3 local Potter Townships supervisors where the plant is located. Construction would be done early 2022. Then Republican Governor Corbett gave Shell $1.6 billion in taxpayer dollars toward construction, which will only provide 500 to 600 permanent jobs afterwards. It equates to a $2.7 million per job subsidy. The PA, that's an interesting breakdown. Thanks for sharing that. The PA legislators were not involved in the decision-making process. It was all local supervisors, 3 people who will negatively affect the region for conceivably 100 years. Yes, the anti-fracking community voiced strong opposition during the process, constant public appearances during the meetings to no avail. So, yeah. Who is currently, would someone share like what organizations are currently working on confronting the Shell plastics cracker plant? What's some of the important work that we can get involved in with that?
Ryan, this is Marcia.
Hi, Marcia.
Currently, it's Beaver County Marcellus Awareness Community, BC MAC. It's Beaver County Voice for Change, which is a community group in Beaver who is made up of a lot of very upper class middle white people who finally realized that, oh my goodness, this could be bad. And then we have Ohio Valley Environmental Resistance in Pittsburgh, where under the Breathe Project umbrella in Pittsburgh, we have Environmental Integrity Project, Food and Water Watch. I mean, it's just, it's just numerous people.
Thank you.
Yeah, Food and Water Watch, Breathe Project.
Okay.
Many. I mean, we're all working together on this for a long, long time. And the thing is too, before Potter Township, these 3 supervisors, 3 country supervisors, they were wined and dined by Shell. Before they made the decision, we asked for a public hearing and they granted it. But all of our expert witnesses were put on. The public hearing went on till like 1 a.m. in the morning, and the press left at 10. And our public witnesses were not put on. Our expert testimony was not put on till like 11:30. Wow. Press wasn't even there.
They have a lot of the same tactics all over different states and communities. So
and every time they would have one of their dog and pony shows where it was a big public event, no one's allowed to stand up and ask a question. Afterward, they have several tables in the background, in the back, and afterwards you have to go to that table. And then of course, no other participants in the group can hear what you're asking. And that's exactly the way they want it. We tried to get up and ask questions, and there were police there. We probably should have risked getting arrested. We didn't, but we tried.
We've taught the industry very well, haven't we? They know exactly how to handle this.
They sure do. It's insidious and devious.
Well, we're definitely going to have to work together across different regions and find ways to support each other so that we can come out you know, at the times that it really matters. So thank you for sharing that. That's, you know, I don't have you know, that's awful the way that that played out. And
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
All right, so we're gonna wrap up in just a minute, but Steve, you got your hand raised.
Yeah.
So yeah, go for it, Steve.
Hopefully you can hear me.
Yes.
Okay, good. Hey, so we're producing a documentary about the politics behind the whole petro build out with the shell cracker and other grand plans. And for that, I spent, you know, all winter during the lockdown, pouring through hours and hours of archival video from committee room deliberations in the House and Senate in Pennsylvania and the chamber floors. And one thing, all the boosters, every time they frame their argument in terms of jobs, and they like to grandstand about it. They often start their comments by saying how their father or their family got their start in the petro industry, and if it weren't for that, they wouldn't even be in the legislature, have the opportunity to blah, blah, blah. And so my thought is that for messaging, they seem to think jobs is a huge part of messaging. I don't know if they do all their focus groups and polling, but that seems to be their main deal, jobs. And I figure you all know that. But as far as messaging goes, I think that seems to be a tender spot for them.
Yeah, I mean, Steve, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, they have effectively at this point lost or are losing the arguments about health, about environment. You know, the Ohio Valley Institute and some others are really focused on hammering them on the jobs and economic results question because, frankly, what they can point to is extremely poor. And I think we're going to be able to chip away at that last bastion that they have sort of rhetorically. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right that they tend to start and end with that one argument. But it's not borne out in reality. They haven't actually managed to on net produce large numbers of jobs and investment into the fracking counties. And the ORVI has looked at that in an analytical way, and we'll be doing more.
Yeah, it just seems like you ought to play up the job possibilities in you know, clean energy and everything else. I mean, just tit for tat.
Hey, Steve, try quality of jobs.
That's an interesting point. Yeah. Thanks, JD. Karen, you've got your hand raised, and then that's going to be the last comment, and then we're going to close out, see if Eric and Joanne want to add anything.
Thanks, and hi, Steve. Nice to see you. I just wanted to mention, because Better Path Coalition is circulating a letter on carbon capture and storage, to Steve's point about jobs. That's the next chapter. We have to be able to see these things on the horizon. And so it was petrochemicals first as a way of extending the industry's life. Then it kind of shifted to LNG exports, which is happening in eastern Pennsylvania. And now it's the jobs promise of carbon capture and storage. And at the beginning of our letter, I quote a DOE representative speaking to a Pennsylvania audience. It was a webinar that includes talks from one of our state senators, from former DEP chief, whatever his name is, I can't think of it right now, but it's all these people who are speaking up in favor of carbon capture and storage on the Democratic side. And what the DOE guy said at the beginning of his talk was fossil fuels are here to stay. And it's all about jobs. And so they're going to do the same thing to us they've done to us a million times over, and we need to be prepared. So I would ask everybody on this, in this group, if you're from Pennsylvania, to sign the letter. We have to stop it. We only have a few months. Governor Wolf is about to, by October, he's about to announce a regional CO2 transport plan. So we're going to go all in on this, and it's going to be another generation of the same nonsense.
All right. Well, Eric, do you have any final comments before we wrap up?
Just two real quickly. I mean, first, thanks to everyone for being on the call. Karen, I'm glad you brought up the carbon capture thing, which is connected to planned hydrogen development. ORVI's going to write about that a lot soon. I share your view that this is the way to repeat the last 10 years, and that it's a potential disaster in the making. So I think we need to get out in front of it. But that's, more to say about that later. I appreciate everyone, participating in this call to talk about the existing polling results, and they'll be out tomorrow morning. So please do let me know if you have further thoughts. And again, Ryan, thanks for all your help.
Great. And Marty made a comment in the chat, said, let's make sure these results get the attention they deserve. Reach out to Eric and Joanna if you're working on a letter to the editor or other campaign that can lean on these results to back your work. So yeah, thanks for that, Marty. All right, folks, I'm going to send out the replay to you via email. So you'll get a chance to check that out if you want. And we have started wrapping up these sessions with a song. So I'm actually going to share my screen and share a song. So for those of you who want to stick around for that, but otherwise, thank you so much for joining, and we'll be connecting with you inside Halt the Harm Network. Thanks, Eric, and thanks, everybody. Thanks, Joanne. I'm also accepting submissions for the song database. So we just have a few in there right now. So please send me stuff if you have anything. This is a song called My Water's on Fire by a group of NYU students.
Fracking is a form of natural gas drilling, an alternative to oil because the oil kept spilling, bringing jobs. Feet down, the cracks release the gas that powers your town. That well's fracked, yeah, totally fracked. But there's more in the water than just H2O. Toxic chemicals help to make the fluid flow. With names like benzene and formaldehyde, you better keep them far away from the water supply. The drillers say the fishes are a mile below. The groundwater pumped into American homes, but don't tell it to the residents of Subway. That water's fracked. We're talking benzene. What the fuck is going on with all this fracking going on? I think we need some facts to come to light. I know we want our energy, but nothing ever comes for free. I think my water's on fire tonight. So it all goes back to 2005. Bush said gas drillers didn't have to comply with the Safe Drinking Water Act before too long. It was frack, baby, frack until the break of dawn. With the EPA out, it was up to the states, but they didn't have the money to investigate. Sick people couldn't prove fracking was to blame. All the while, water wells were rolling up in flames. Cause it's hard to contain all the methane released. It can get into the air, it can get into the streams. It's a greenhouse gas worse than CO2. Fracking done wrong can lead to climate change too. Now it's not that drillers should never be fracking, but the current regulation is severely lacking. Reduce the toxins contained, the gas and wastewater, and the people will get sick, and the planet will get hotter. What the fuck is going on with all this fracking going on? I think we need some facts to come to light. I know we want our energy, but nothing ever comes for free. I think my water's on fire tonight.
All right, thanks everyone, and I will see you later. Take care.
Right on.